My guest today is Tracy Shuchart, correct? Tracy Shuchart?
Shuchart, yes.
Shuchart. Okay.
Age is silent.
Yes. Tracy Shuchart.
I started in the industry back in the early 2000s at the Chicago Board of Trade. I was a broker at a literal boiler room, hawking options on futures, literally calling 400 people a day, right? Asking them for money. And this was like back in the day when it was like $70 a round turn, crazy, right? For commissions. But so I started there and I really worked my way up in the industry into some better brokerages. And then I moved to the floor because I worked at Chicago Board of Trade and I met a bunch of traders there, floor traders there. So I managed a trade desk in the bond room and the ag room until the floor died, essentially. And then I went out on my own. I managed money. I still do manage money for a family office for energy and materials. And then I just started my own macro research firm for energy and materials.
I am a big fan of your work. I discovered you on Twitter at, is it Chai Girl or how do you pronounce that?
Yeah. Because I was living in Chicago.
Okay.
Chicago, get it? Chai Girl.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Currently over 270,000 followers. And one thing I wanted to do in this podcast, I want to encourage people to go out there and follow you because your feed is really good in terms of providing all sorts of information about what's going on in the energy markets. And you do touch on climate a little bit too. You are doing Twitter Spaces too, right? Through that account?
Yes, I have. Actually, I hold a Spaces for Place Your Trades every Wednesday on commodities, generally energy. And then I have my own podcast called Mic Drop Markets that is a wider range encompassing the financial markets in general.
One thing I just saw today, I wanted to ask you about is a headline that says natural gas prices could fall below zero in parts of Europe. What do you think about that?
I know it's really not that unusual. We've seen that happen in the US as well. Not the benchmark that people are currently trading, which is Henry Hub, but we've seen Waha go negative in the US quite often. So that's not a surprise. Now, I don't think we'll necessarily see the TTF contract, that's the European contract. I don't think that we'll see that contract go negative, but it's still pretty elevated where it is pretty elevated in comparison to their normal range still, even though it's fallen 80% off those highs of summer 2022. But I don't think we'll necessarily see gas prices go negative in Europe if you're talking about the benchmarks.
Okay. So I didn't even know that it's not that unusual for that to happen. How about with oil? I think that happened during COVID. Didn't it drop almost to negative?
It was negative $37 for that. That was that expiring May contract that happened. It happened in April. And yeah, we did see prices go negative, but that was a whole lot of macro things going on at the same time. You had this spat between Russia and Saudi Arabia. They kind of left that OPEC meeting in March saying, okay, forget this deal. We're going to turn on the taps. And at that same time, COVID came along and the world's shutting down. So it was just a macro landscape that led to negative oil prices. That was really only for that month. And really that contract was expiring. You also had a problem that generally you're supposed to have retail traders out of there and funds out of there after options expiration and just the physical traders left when you come towards expiry. And what happened is there was a bunch of hedge funds in China, and a couple of brokers in the US didn't roll their retail customers out. And so there was just a lot of mishap happened at that time.
Had you ever seen anything like that before? Or do you expect to see it again? Is it that rare?
No.
Okay, sorry. Another thing you just retweeted here interested me. No more Russian gas will reach Austria by the end of 2024. Currently, Austria's dependence on Russian gas is 78%. How worried should the people of Austria be about that?
I would be very worried for Austria because it's cheap Russian gas, right? So they're getting it a lot cheaper. And even last year when we saw energy prices spike, their electricity prices went up significantly, even though they get a lot of their natural gas from Russia because power prices in general went up. And I think this is Austria tries to be neutral. I think this is not good news for them. We'll see if they can negotiate something beyond that. But really, it has to do, the pipeline runs through Ukraine. And so it's Ukraine's decision to shut that down. If they want to or not, again, this is what they're expecting, but we'll have to see what kind of negotiations go along, because I think that'll be very difficult for them to lose 78% of their gas all of a sudden.
Is there any way they could get some LNG there somehow by the end of 2024? Is that a possibility?
Yeah, it's a possible. The problem is that they just don't have the storage facilities for that. And so likely they would have to have Germany store that for them.
What do you think about Europe in general? I know there was a lot of worry last winter they were going to run out. Do you think they're out of the woods, or is there another problem looming next winter now?
Yeah, I don't think they're necessarily out of the woods. I think they got very lucky that there was a mild winter. They forced a lot of manufacturing to shut down as well. And if you remember, even prior to the Ukraine invasion, Europe started having problems in fall of 2021 already. And they were seeing smelters go down because they had very high natural gas prices already, certainly not to 2022 levels, but they were elevated enough that they saw a lot of industry shut down. So they were very lucky in the fact that they had a mild winter. They had a lot of manufacturing that was already shut in. And so they didn't have a problem, but that's not to say, so they got lucky. I think they're 66% full. I expect to be 79% full by next fall. But again, they got very lucky. I don't think they're necessarily out of the woods yet.
How do you think we're going to do it, like in the U.S., for example? Are we spending enough on capital expenditures so we're going to have hydrocarbons in the next 5 years, or that's a problem?
No, yeah, that's going to be a problem. And you've noticed for the past couple of years, obviously, we have all these oil and gas companies. They're focusing on investor returns, paying down debt, dividends, stock buybacks. And certainly that's to the behest of their investors. And I don't think investors are even willing to have these people. I don't think investors want them to start spending crazy like they used to. And so CapEx is down. We probably, in my opinion, won't get over that height of over 13 million barrels a day that we reached in 2019, probably anytime soon again. We are already starting to see, with kind of these depressed prices, even though they're still relatively high, comparatively speaking, since we've come off those highs, we're already seeing a lot of rigs shut down, especially with gas, especially gas rigs. So I think in the month of May, we've had the most rigs taken offline since 2016, when we had second big oil crash. So I think that the further prices are depressed, we're still going to see, but the break-evens aren't worth it anymore, right? It's just not, the cost is just not worth it. And so if we stay down here or lower, we'll probably see more rigs come up as well.
I'm just curious how you stay informed. As I listen to you on podcasts, you have all these figures at your fingertips. Are you using any public information, or do you have back channels to figure this out?
No. I use all the information I can find possible, obviously. And I just read a lot.
Okay. So a lot of it is out there for the public to read. It's not behind.
You should be able to research it. And of course, I do get some proprietary research from other people, but there is information out there that is free to the public. And then there's the next level up would be information that's not free to the public, that's available to the public for a fee, if you're, depending on what really you're interested in. And then that would be something like our service. And then there's obviously the institutional side.
How big of a factor is it, the whole climate hysteria factor in terms of hydrocarbon supply in the U.S.? Is that a big deal, the demonization, because they're causing bad weather?
Yes, of course, that's a huge problem. And we have seen the Biden administration, even though they purport to support the industry, I have a list of 150 things that they have done so far. I'm not going to go through them all, but I have a list of 150 things they have done, and that's a literal number, that has moved against the oil and gas industry. And so certainly that's a big challenge. And that's also a big challenge for Europe. And that's why they're definitely not out of the woods yet. And we seem to be dead pan on following down this disastrous path where let's just shut down hydrocarbons and throw up some nuclear wind. Do we have storage capacity for that? No. Okay, that'll work. And it's intermittent power. You need something, you either need nuclear, you need gas, or you need oil. You need something that's not intermittent as your power source, particularly if you don't have storage available. And that technology just doesn't exist yet. There's a lot of companies investing in battery storage technology, but it's still not there yet to use. On one hand, you're trying to shut down something else and then have no power. So it absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. And so it's going to be an uphill battle. I think Europe is in a worse position than we are, for certain, because they're way far gone down that route and are not looking to turn back. At least in the US, we have Congress. So, that helps a little bit.
Do you have a sense that people in the business world in Europe actually believe that hydrocarbons cause bad weather, and maybe there's less of a belief in the US, or what do you think?
No, I think this was this massive rush to jump on this ESG train, right? Except for, and we saw a lot of banks and a lot of insurers say they weren't going to insure you if you didn't have a high enough ESG score, or banks saying they're going to stop investing in oil and gas by such and such date. We are starting to see a little pushback because I think that energy crisis, of course, scared the truth into some people, right? And I think by no stretch of the imagination is that crisis over. I think we're just in a lull. But we did see Vanguard just recently leave the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is a huge move. And then we also saw a handful of insurers leave the Net Zero Insurance Alliance. And so I think we're starting to see a little bit of a turnaround from these big institutions.
I saw those, I think, on your Twitter feed, and those made me very happy that Vanguard jumped and the insurers jumped. How much encouragement should I take from that? I really want to see everybody to jump away from it.
Well, it's like a baby toe in the water.
You just did a Twitter space, I think, with Carol Roth about You Will Own Nothing. I'm very interested in that subject. That book is not out yet, but I didn't listen to the whole thing, but what'd you think of that?
She's fantastic. It was fantastic. And she explained it in a way that it didn't come off as being this tinfoil hat theory, because it's not. If you're looking at exactly what they're trying to do and what they're trying to implement as far as CBDC and things of that nature. But it's really, she goes into depth in the book a lot about, these policies and what they're implementing and what that's going to mean to you. But at the end, it's a little more hopeful. Like what you can do to protect yourself. But I think that book comes out on July 18th and you can pre-order it from Amazon. So there's your plug, Carol.
Excellent. Very nice. For me, the whole thing with the Canadian truckers was a big wake-up call that they were able to freeze people's accounts. You probably were all clued in before that. I think they did a great service, the truckers, by getting involved in this.
Oh, that was utterly insane. I was living in Canada until they finally opened the border and I moved back to the US. And that obviously happened after I had moved. But, that's insane to me. They were able to literally freeze your bank accounts, and they were going after people that gave to their GoFundMe. Right. And so if you were just wanted to support these truckers and you're just a Canadian citizen and you sent them $5, they wanted to come after you. That's very frightening.
Right. Yeah. It sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it actually happened in real life. I think it's a great thing to point to that it happened already. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Before I forget, do you have a list publicly of those 150 things that the administration is doing? Have you published anything about that?
I will. I'll publish something.
You have a subscription portion of your Twitter as well, right? I just saw that today. Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I have that. And then I also have Renegade Resources, which is my Substack. So okay. I got a lot going on.
You do have a lot going on. What comments do you have about this whole idea of killing off cows in the Netherlands because cows cause bad weather?
Oh my, okay. That's another ridiculous thing. And we just saw Ireland come out and say they wanted to kill 200,000 cows within the next 3 years for climate goals. This is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous. They're going after agriculture, which is, there are so many other fixes than killing food, right? Than killing your food. But I think this is what they want. Eat bugs. It's much better for you. But certainly agriculture isn't my forte, but talking to people that it is. There's a lot of things that you can do. There's a lot of technology out there in agriculture to reduce sort of your greenhouse gases. But certainly if you talk to ranchers, they're like, especially if you have grass-fed cattle, right? It's a cyclical environment and it's not harming the environment whatsoever. I always say, I don't know if these people are really that dumb or that nefarious, right? Is it on purpose or are they really that stupid?
They actually are succeeding, though, in closing down farms in the Netherlands. That looks like that is going to happen or is happening.
It looks like it is going to happen. I think they're going to have an upheld battle. They just had elections and a new party started, was like a farmer party, and they literally won the majority of the seats in this brand new party. So we'll have to see how that goes. But obviously the plan still is in place to basically confiscate your farm. It's either we'll pay you for it. If you decide not to, we're just going to take it. So it's basically confiscation, right?
So I often think those things can happen here. It seems like in the U.S. that couldn't happen, or could it?
I think you would have a bigger problem in the United States with that. Okay. Especially with the farm lobby. And I think you would have, I think you're going to have a harder problem doing that in the US, particularly with the way that our government is set up.
How about this whole "you will eat the bugs" sales pitch? Who came up with that, and why would they think that's going to work? And what % of people are going to say, yeah, we're going to eat bugs to prevent bad weather?
Anybody's followed me for any time. That's my... I've been on that because I think it's ridiculous. They're going to make you eat bugs because it's a WEF kind of thing, basically, when they came out with a whole ad that was like, you will own nothing and be happy. You'll live in 15-minute cities. You'll be eating bugs and you won't have to worry about anything because, you'll be on UBI. Right. Just corralling the useless eaters. So obviously it's someone's idea. And I guess the big think tanks decided that you should eat bugs instead. I really don't see that taking off. Again, in the United States, I think we're particularly insulated from a lot of these things, but never say never.
Yeah, Mark Morano just tweeted, I think, recently about the climate lockdowns. He's calling this deal in France where they're going to ban short-haul flights to prevent bad weather as a lockdown. So only the people who have private jets can do this. What do you think?
Yeah, the WEF basically said we're going to have climate lockdowns. However, that kind of manifests itself, like you're already seeing 15-minute cities in the UK. They're it's a test pilot program in Oxford, but other communities are also talking about that. And so those kinds of things are happening. And the WEF basically said we're going to have climate lockdowns. Now, what I think is going to happen is that people are going to hit a point, and I think people are hitting the point where the pendulum's going to swing the other way, right? Because you always know once the pendulum goes really hardcore one way, it tends to come flying back the other way. And so I think that if you look, and particularly in Europe, because I read a lot of local stuff in Europe, and these people, they don't agree with their government. I'm not sure why they elect them, but that's a whole nother story. But you're beginning to see really a lot of unrest and a lot of pendulum swinging. You just saw the conservatives in Spain win the local elections so much that the liberal federal government decided to freak out and call a snap election in July because they're worried that they're going to get kicked out of the office on the next federal election. So I think you're beginning to see, and then you have in Italy as well, conservatives, Brian Maloney, right? One. And so I think you're beginning to see a pushback from the people. Enough is enough.
How about the entire push to electric vehicles? In your work, that's a big deal, right? As prices of lithium, and it makes a huge difference business-wise, right? If we're forced into those vehicles. And
the goals are ridiculous. First of all, we don't have the grid capacity. Just start with Europe and the United States both have very aging grid systems. Our electricity grid's a century old, and we just keep building on top of it. It's really not completely efficient how it's running now because we just put new technology on top of old technology, and it's piecemealed together. So really what you're going to have to do, and I just read a recent study, we're going to need 1 million more miles of transition lines just to get to 2035 goals, forget 2050 goals. And nobody's budgeting for that. Where's the money coming from? Nobody's going to pay that. That's trillions and trillions of dollars. So literally our grid system can't handle those sorts of goals. Look at California already has rolling blackouts, and they have a very aggressive EV target. They're going to literally stop selling ICE vehicles, I think by 2034 or 2035. I'd be a car dealership right across in Nevada if I were you. But I think literally our grid system can't handle it. And so I think these goals are way off. If everybody went EV tomorrow, the whole country would shut down. We'd crash the entire grid. And we just aren't spending the money to upkeep, to really spend the money in the infrastructure that's really needed. Sure, we just had the Inflation Reduction Act that has infrastructure spending, but not even 1/10 nearly as much to hit these goals whatsoever. We need to fix our bridges first. Let's be real. And we have a lot of crumbling infrastructure that needs to be taken care of before we set these EV goals, I think. And then there was like that ridiculous, they want to build 500 electric EVs in like rural neighborhoods. Those people are not buying, or in lower class neighborhoods. Like nobody's buying $70,000 EVs in those neighborhoods.
Do you think lots of investors are putting real money up based on the idea that there won't be internal combustion engine cars in California in 15 years? Is it?
I don't think any. I think all the car manufacturers are obviously jumping on that trend. If we look at the United States, for example, we're only at 12% of our EV sales in the United States. Anybody hard pressed to, everybody loves their SUVs here, their gas guzzling SUVs. And because we're so spread out, we do a lot of driving here, and it makes it impractical if there's no charging station around, right? And you need to drive over 200 miles, which tons of people do.
I have heard people make the argument that if you do live in a city and you only drive 10 miles every day to and from work, then a short range EV could make sense. I'm okay with that. Yeah.
I think that totally makes sense. But for the rest of us, especially if you drive a lot, I don't know if you've read Alex's book, A Fossil Future.
Yeah.
And I had him on my podcast before as well. But really, he lays out a very good argument why this climate hysteria is hysteria. Yep. And if you look back in history, and this is definitely, again, not really my area of expertise, but if you look back in history, they've been saying the world's going to be ending since the 1960s, 50s. We're all going to, if you go back and just Google like old headlines, we're all going to die by 1990, the 70s, the coming ice age. We're all going to freeze to death by 2000. There's a lot of hysteria out there. If you look at a lot of the data, and certainly there is a lot of people to follow out there on Twitter, that this is their specialty. We have lower deaths from natural disasters. We have really no more natural disasters today that we had before. Carbon is the source of all life. If we get rid of all the CO2 in the air, we'll die. Everything will die, and we will die.
Yeah, Richard Lindzen said that on my podcast. He was saying that what kind of pollutant is it? If you get rid of it, you die. I think that's a very good point that you and him made. Do you think much about the 2024 election in terms of its effect on the work that you're doing? I suppose it makes a huge difference who gets elected.
Obviously, that's going to make a very huge difference on which way that swings. Obviously, Congress is also a huge deal. Really, I think what would be beneficial for the hydrocarbon industry, obviously, is to have a Republican-led House or Senate or both. Yeah, and elections obviously factor in for a lot of reasons, but not just for that industry. Because I think even if we had a straight Republican win, say across the board, still going to be really difficult for some of these to convince some of these companies to pump more oil. Like I know some candidates have been saying, oh, we'll have them pump more. It's going to be difficult to get these companies to do that too. So although probably we'd have looser regulations and more federal land sales and things of that nature, and maybe get the Keystone XL pipeline built, certainly that would make things better for the industry. But again, there's still a lot of red tape and bureaucratic red tape in government, of course, as usual.
So do you spend a lot of time thinking about that, or about who's going to win, or analyzing that? Or
So it doesn't really factor into the research that we really do. I mean, we're looking more at, say, these ESG goals in terms of how realistic is it? And it's not just for say, EVs, electric vehicles, but if just building electric vehicles. Like we need more copper than we've ever produced since the beginning of time, literally, to reach these goals. And there's just no projects going up. You need more lithium, you need more nickel, you need all of these metals, right? And so over the next few years, not necessarily tomorrow, I think we'll probably have a lithium glut until like 2026, and then we'll really see that start to taper off. But to reach these goals, we're going to need a lot more mining. And mining's had the same problem over the last 7 years as oil is. That's just, there's no capex. And mining's really dirty and energy intensive. That doesn't fit ESG goals. So it's like a circular problem here.
Do you have your eye on any possible breakthroughs in energy technology? Do you think we'll have basically the same energy technology with no huge breakthroughs in 20 years? Or do you think you're looking at fusion or anything else?
Yeah, I think definitely think you'll have breakthroughs. If you look at, say, like these smaller nuclear reactors that are coming online, the UK is going to adapt them. So it's really hard there's this aversion in the West to nuclear, which is insane to me because you want green goals, right? You had Germany shut down nuclear plants and open coal and reopen coal plants, which is like, literally makes no sense whatsoever. But I think nuclear, certainly, I think fusion's probably a long way off, although there's a lot of hope in that. But I wish people would get more interested in nuclear and get wiser about it. And I'm sure you'll have battery technology move up, improve as well, and battery storage. But then again, you have to look at, they're very expensive right now. Their storage capability is not that great. And then recycling these, you can't recycle 90% of this, right? And so then again, you're just putting toxic materials into a landfill. It's the same thing with wind turbines, right? When the wind turbines go down, they just put them in a giant landfill because you can't recycle them. All these things that people think are clean are not. And you also have to look at the life of, during the manufacturing process, how carbon intensive is it? I think they've done studies on EVs where you have to drive it over 50,000 miles until you get break even on the total emissions. And the technology is not there yet. I'm sure that it'll improve, but I think newer, better technology needs to come along. Of course, you have the oil and gas industry looking into carbon capture. But again, I was just talking about this with someone. First of all, it's really expensive. Everybody's talking about carbon capture. We're going to do carbon capture. But the problem is that it's really expensive and there's not enough carbon to capture to make this worth it, believe it or not. What they're finding is they have to spend billions of dollars for this technology and it won't pay off because there's not enough carbon to capture. So therein lies another problem of all this hysteria right now.
Yeah, so personally, I think that whole idea is completely insane anyway, because I think the world with 800 parts per million CO2 is probably better for life than 280 parts per million CO2.
Right? I'm telling you, trees need it.
You touched on CBDC in the past. I just wanted to ask, do you think that the bad guys are going to be successful and they're going to be monitoring how many hamburgers we buy per month, all that?
I think that is very likely to happen in some areas, unfortunately. I think you will see that probably in China, and I think you'll probably get close to something like that in Europe. I think the US will be the last to do it if they are going to do it. But I don't know how feasible that is just because of the nature of the American people compared to, we're not a very compliant people, generally speaking. Right? So I do think that you will see CBDC in some form or another. I don't know if it'll get to the point where they're monitoring every morsel of food you eat, although I do think we could see that in China to some extent. It'll just depend on do they force people into this, or is it a voluntary thing? And if it's a voluntary thing, that's completely different than you have to give us all your dollars and we'll give you digital dollars.
Any thoughts on Bitcoin as a way to opt out of that? Is that a possibility?
I don't know enough really about Bitcoin, honestly. I do think I like the idea of a decentralized currency where you're your own bank and you're in charge of that. And certainly I think that is a very good thing. But that unfortunately, Bitcoin's just not my area of expertise. But I think the technology is great. And I think that having power over your bank per se is a very good idea. I think the more we decentralize things right now, that's literally how this country started. That's why we have 3 branches of government, because we wanted decentralization literally at the heart of what this country was founded on. And and that's why we were a republic and all the states were in charge of their own deal. And then you had the federal government that had limited powers. And suddenly, over time, this federal government grew bloated, right? And there's so much in the federal government. But really at the heart of how this country started was to be decentralized. And I think that's very important. I just want to give people hope, because I think lately I feel like there's so much pressure, things are getting worse by the minute, and the world's getting crazier by the minute, and governments are getting crazier by the minute. So I do want to give people hope that I think there are alternatives out there, and I think the pendulum will swing back again into some sort of sanity, right? We're not all living in 15-minute cities in the dark.
Excellent. Yeah, good note to end on. All right. Thanks a ton for sharing your expertise. I really respect what you're doing. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Talk to you next time. Goodbye.